So I guess for me, many business problems are solved through the implementation of technology solutions, and there are many good technology solutions out there that are becoming even more prevalent in today's business environment. However, critical to any business problem or any successful technology implementation is the building of processes, governance and effective MI around that technology solution to ensure that any problem that is solved in a sustainable way, and that technology isn't just, doesn't just become shelfware essentially. And therefore Protiviti brings the process and the governance to that implementation, and clearly ClusterSeven brings the technology solution, and we've partnered together on many different client problems in that way. I think the first thing for me is to understand what are the really significant spreadsheet models out there, and to focus on those models first in terms of how significant they are to the business, how complex they are as a model, and really don't try and solve the whole organisation's problems first. Really focus on those high value areas, look to build technology around those high value areas and make that sustainable. Then go out and understand what the rest of the estate is about. I think some of the key considerations we'll come on to in a moment is around the significance of the spreadsheet. What is significant to your organisation? Complexity can be driven a little bit by the technology, and it can give you an idea of the likelihood of error, but really it's important to think about what is significant to the organisation and what defines significance. So is it financial value? Is it reputational value? So think about a spreadsheet leaving the organisation and being found on a laptop or being published to a competitor, and the potential reputational damage around that. And that's, that allows you to build up both measures and thresholds of your risk appetite around these significant spreadsheets. So there's a number of key components to a policy. One is, we talked a little bit about significance and defining what significance is, and that clearly needs to be stated within the policy. We also need to determine who owns the policy. Any policy that's defined with an organisation, having ownership and governance around that policy is incredibly important. We often see policies in this space, the spreadsheet risk management space, assigned to the CIO and the IT managers. Typically where organisations have assigned to it an IT manager often fails, because actually the critical spreadsheets sit within the business, and therefore the IT individual isn't empowered to drive some of the activities defined within the policy. So that is absolutely critical we get that right. The other part is actually to define what a critical spreadsheet is for your organisation, and getting the definition right is so important. You can have a very broad definition of what is a critical spreadsheet, because clearly you don't want every spreadsheet to be within the remit of the technology, but you need to be very clear, and it needs to be very unambiguous around what a critical spreadsheet is. So that might have a policy description around the nature of what the spreadsheet might be doing. Is it performing calculations of critical business processes? It might be around the perceived significance of that spreadsheet. So that's another key component. So ownership, the definition, the significance factors, i.e. how scary is this spreadsheet for us? And then really we need to think about how we govern that policy. So how do we understand that that policy is being adhered to? I would hugely recommend not creating a spreadsheet policy team that runs around the organisations looking for spreadsheets. So we need to think very clearly about how we oversee the effectiveness of that policy. So one of the aspects of policy implementation, we've talked a bit about the process, we've talked about the definitions. Never underestimate the value in training and awareness. This is a problem that's inherent across any organisation. Everybody uses spreadsheets. We need to be very practical in our definitions. We understand, set the bar high initially in terms of only get to the scary stuff first, but train and educate the business. I've seen examples of mouse mats, coffee mugs. You go to the coffee area of an organisation, there's lots about HR, health and safety. Spreadsheet risk is a risk that impacts everybody. Think about some of those activities. Leverage the marketing teams and the internal training teams that you have within your organisation to roll out computer-based training, offer up services around spreadsheet risk management. So, within an organisation, don't always think of it as a stick, a compliance stick. Think about it as offering a toolkit into the organisation. So we provide you with technology like ClusterSeven. We provide you with development standards and training. We've got generalist awareness around the organisation. So people see it as a service coming to them rather than as being hit with a compliance stick. where we've seen a real focus for this in the last 10 years is particularly in financial services. And we've talked previously about the compliance stick to some extent, but actually outside of FS now, non-FS, we're seeing a much more mature approach to operational risk management. And we're talking about many operational risk, spreadsheet risk being one of them. So a lot of our non-FS clients are looking to understand how they manage this spreadsheet risk. And we're seeing particularly industries like pharmaceutical industry, manufacturing industry, where there's significant high-value IP which might be managed within spreadsheets, and spreadsheets are communicated around the organisation. So there's a much more increased awareness of the problem. We're also seeing non-exec boards asking the questions around their exposure to spreadsheet risk. And that's not only from an integrity perspective, but also from a confidentiality perspective. So spreadsheets are really within the remit of unstructured data. It's all the data that sits outside our core systems, and where those spreadsheets are used and how they're being communicated, be it inside the organisation or externally. It's really important for organisations to understand where those spreadsheets exist. I think what's coming over the horizon as well is something called the Global Data Protection Regulation, which is everybody's going to have to comply with, be it FS or non-FS, and therefore these non-FS organisations, which represent the majority of the industry in the UK, are going to have to understand somehow where all this data sits. You can't just look at the SAP environment or your core systems anymore. Actually, so much data exists outside within spreadsheets, and including things like emails and Word documents. But let's be frank, spreadsheets would represent the largest part of that population. So where is that data? How do we control it? And clearly, technology can help you do that across the vast estate. So it's a serious consideration for boards going forward. So in terms of the processes around any policy, they need to understand how I guess there's a number of key factors, how we identify the policy, identify the critical spreadsheets themselves, then the processes around what control standards should be implemented around policy, around the spreadsheet. So we need a consistent set of control standards that meet a set of control objectives and manage a set of risks. So both the identification of the spreadsheets, the significance of the spreadsheets, and also what control standards are required. And process needs to be put around that. Where we see it really successfully implemented it when we integrate it into current risk management processes within a business. So if a business considers people risk, for example, and evaluates their exposure to credit market risk, for example, as well, we want to see organisations expose themselves, understand what spreadsheet risk might mean, and to do that within the processes that exist today, rather than creating risk management processes specifically for spreadsheets, because we see that too often fail. We need to leverage governance structures and risk committees that exist today and provide transparency around what that spreadsheet risk is and ensure that people are satisfying those control standards. What I would say though as well is ask the business to self-attest to what they are doing with the spreadsheets within their own functions. So for example, if you are talking in a front office environment or a HR department or a finance department, let's make sure those people are self-attesting, on a quarterly basis or a half-yearly basis, that they have implemented the right controls, that they've identified all the correct spreadsheets that meet the criteria in the policy, and they're implementing those control standards. Okay, so we've talked a bit about policy and defining standards, significance criteria, definitions, etc. To ensure it is sustainable, and it's a word that I'm using all the time, but we need effective business processes around the policy to ensure that we are identifying spreadsheets consistently, we are implementing those control standards, and we are seeking to perform remediation where we do see gaps in the control standards. So process needs to consider those core sub-processes and put reporting around those processes to ensure we've got good transparency of what is going on around the business. I think with any policy implementation and associated processes though, we need to give the organisation a practical amount of time for implementation. What you don't want to be is out of compliance from day one. So we need to think about what are the high risk areas, which parts of the business will value this policy the most, and therefore how we would implement such processes. I think the other key part to me as well is to have the business self-attest to this, these standards on a regular basis, be it quarterly or half yearly. And we can do that through current operational risk processes within organisations. Whilst that's particularly biased towards FS at the moment, in non-FS we're seeing increased use of operational risk processes. So don't create a spreadsheet risk management process. It often isn't sustainable. What we need is something much more effective and efficient, and we do that by leveraging processes that exist today really, and governance board and risk committees that are evaluating things like market risk, credit risk, people risk, and spreadsheet risk is just another operational risk. So some of the pitfalls with any spreadsheet risk management implementation is where people do just think technology is the answer. It's clearly a key component of the answer, but thinking about how the technology will be operated, run, and deliver that level of control you require is absolutely key. So sustainability is important. I think another key pitfall is the lack of training and awareness around the organisation. People often underestimate that actually sharing of knowledge and development standards is something that the organisation wants to consume. And I think one of the other big pitfalls I see is thinking technology is the only answer. And I think this is key because the technology is great for controlling a spreadsheet as it sees it, but let's check that spreadsheet is right before we load it into the technology. Don't just assume the technology will answer every problem. So by that I mean you've got a remediation around the control standards themselves, but you can also use the tools and technology to look for integrity issues around the spreadsheets as they exist today. So a spreadsheet with 50 tabs in it, thousands of rows of data, could already have errors. You just don't know. So to some extent, what's the point of controlling something that's already got an error in it? So where is that erroneous formula? Where is that erroneous reference? Let's get that right first and then get the technology operating around it.